The first story that I'm going to read for you is entitled The Visitor. This is one of the stories written by Jacob Eppinga, the pastor who served the La Grave Christian Reformed Church in downtown Grand Rapids, Michigan for many years. He has gone to be with the Lord and has blessed his church with many stories that he wrote for many years in his church's denominational periodical called The Banner. So this is one of his stories, The Visitor. Most churches welcome visitors. In vacation areas, visitors sometimes outnumber the members. In more remote and rural areas, visitors are far and few between. Some visitors are shoppers who come to size up the church and its minister. Others are floaters who take their religion cafeteria style. There can be keen competition between congregations as they seek to outdo each other in being visitor-friendly. Having been a visitor myself scores of times, I can attest to the fact that at some churches there is an overwhelming spirit of hospitality. At others, this spirit is non-existent. And at still others, there is a definite anti-visitor tone. Fortunately, the latter two seem to be the exceptions. I remember attending a service years ago in a large city where I lived for a time. I signed a guest book and found a member of the outreach committee on my doorstep the same day. Also outstanding in my memory book was a Lutheran church in another city. The pastor met me at the door, and I could sense from his welcome greeting that it was heartily genuine. Noticing that communion would be served and that some Lutheran churches practiced an exclusive for members only communion, I asked if it was permissible for me also to partake. I have never forgotten his answer. He said, "It is the Lord's table. You must ask him." I don't think I could locate that church today, but it and its pastor still occupy a warm place in my heart. On a sabbatical in Richmond, Virginia, my wife and I and our 4 children attended a Presbyterian church in the neighborhood where we had taken up residence. The second Sunday, we had callers. 2 elders, both who were in their 80s. One was a retired physician, and the other a retired minister who had spent 40 years on the mission field in Africa. I wondered how our children would react to these oldsters. In such visits, the children are often overlooked. These men took a real interest in our 2 sons and 2 daughters. When one of the 2 men preached the sermon on Thanksgiving Day, our children listened intently because they considered him their friend. They remember him to this day. In Cambridge, England, where we spent another sabbatical, 2 matronly women called on us, both dressed in heavy tweeds and both on bicycles. One of them invited us to her house after the service the following Sunday to enjoy a glass of sherry. I said, back home, it's coffee after church. All of these experiences remind me of the book of Proverbs, which tells us to be given to hospitality. They also remind me of my parental home. Strangers in church generally ended up at our house for coffee. My last charge, La Grave Avenue Christian Reformed Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan, was situated directly across the street from a beer store. I invited the proprietor to visit a service. And to my surprise, he came one Sunday morning while his daughter, minded the store. He never came again. But we remained friends. He always remembered the invitation with appreciation. He said no one had ever invited him before. He always feared the possibility of a petition from us to the city council to close him down because of his proximity to the church. One winter, while vacationing in Florida, we attended services in a beautiful church overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Its name was Bethesda at the Sea. I was introduced to the pastor as a minister from Michigan. He asked the name of my church. I told the pastor of Bethesda by the Sea that I was the pastor of LaGrave by the beer store. Next door to the beer store there was a large taxicab garage, complete with a dispatcher who was in constant touch with the cab drivers as they made their way around town. For some reason, his orders were sometimes picked up by our public address system. It was a very disruptive situation. The dispatcher's voice would break into our services at the oddest moments. One elderly member said it was the devil's work. A moment of near hilarity arrived one Sunday morning as I was preaching on the son who said to his father, "I go, sir." But he didn't. Matthew 21, verse 30. No sooner had I said the words than the voice of the dispatcher was heard coming out of our loudspeaker, ordering a driver to go some corner in town to fair. Afterwards, I said to the elderly member that the interruption was not the work of the devil because the devil does not have a sense of humor. Our complaints to the taxicab company bore fruit. A radio tower that reached higher than our church steeple was installed atop their building. I watched a part of the operation, quite fascinated with the expertise of the man doing the job. I met him and I expressed my admiration. I invited him for a cup of coffee. Turned out he was moonlighting. He was a police officer, a lieutenant, no less. Lieutenant Piers. I found out that he was also a Second World War hero, the Congressional Medal of Honor. I invited him to attend one of our services, and he came. He had a commanding appearance that was hard to miss. I shook hands with him, or after the service he said, "I notice that some of your ceiling lights are burned out." I had hoped for some favorable comment on our sanctuary, our choir, or even my sermon. But instead it appeared that he was more interested in, if not in things on high, than in things up high. "Yes," I said, "the church is still quite new and we haven't figured out a way yet to reach those ceiling lights." "Leave it to me," he said. He called the following day to say he had paved the way. He had spoken with some firemen in the fire station down the street and asked them to change our burned out lights. I asked what that would cost. As a favor. He added just to give them each a beer. I wondered whether this was on the up and said so. "What if they are needed for a fire?" He answered, "Those who said they would help would do it off duty." "What about the equipment they will use?" "It is city property, isn't it?" "That's no problem," he said. I considered his answer very enlightening, and I had another thought. "I don't think it is proper," I said, "for a church to give out a case of beer. How about Bibles?" The lieutenant said, "Don't give him anything. Just say thank you." I found this interchange less than satisfying. I thanked the lieutenant and said that I or someone else would get back to him. I called the chairman of the facilities committee and told him about the deal, and I said, "You handle it." Why did I feel a little bit like Pilate washing his hands? A week or so later, I found several firemen in our sanctuary with extension ladders and ropes. They were changing burned out bulb lights, or light bulbs, excuse me. I thanked them. A few days later, I walked past the open doors of the fire station down the street on my way to a nearby hospital. I thanked the men again. They smiled, and one of them said, "Hey, thanks for the beer." The beer? The lieutenant was back in church again, a visitor. I shook his hand at the door. He observed that all the ceiling lights were working. "Looks better," he said. I invited him to come back again. His answer was an invitation. "I've visited you, now you visit me." The police station was an old building completely lacking in charm. It had been marked for razing and replacement in the near future. I was fascinated by the behind-the-scenes activities, but I felt I was out of my element. The lieutenant made small talk, then he suddenly sprang an idea on me. I had been asking about his work and experiences and why he had the reputation of being so fearless. He said, "Why don't you ride with me in the patrol car for a night?" It was more a statement than a question. I said that'd be great, even though I had some reservations about the idea. It really wasn't my cup of tea. I had a part-time assistant at that time, a seminary student. He was gung-ho on this idea when I mentioned it to him. And so it was, on a designated night, I said a fond farewell to my wife, and together with my seminary friend, we showed up at the police station for a night ride with Lieutenant Pierce. My sermon for the following Sunday were prepared just in case I lived long enough to preach them. We were told we would be in a scout car from 11 p.m. in the evening to 7 a.m. It was a quiet night. And I could also say it was quite the night, as you'll find out in a moment. Nothing much happened. We roamed all over town. There was an accident, a fire, a speeder. The lieutenant kept up a running except he stepped down to respond to a directive by radio. It was a secure feeling to go flying through town in excess of the speed limit and know we wouldn't get a ticket. Around 2 a.m. we stopped at coffee. There were a few others nursing coffee cups. The banter was light and pleasant. Lieutenant introduced me as his supervisor, even though I didn't look the part, and I introduced my assistant as mine. Refreshed, we were off again. My assistant was getting sleepy, and he had exams coming up. Since the night was mostly spent and nothing big was happening, he suggested that we drop him off somewhere when we came close to his neighborhood. I had the same inclination, but on second thought, decided to stick it out till 7 a.m. No sooner had we dropped off the seminary student at his home, we were given instructions to proceed pell-mell to an all-night store a few blocks away from my church, where a robbery had just taken place. We must have hit 60, the siren wailing. I was wishing that the lieutenant would go a little slower so we would be a little late. I had no desire to be in the middle of a situation, but it was obvious that my lieutenant, honored for bravery at World War II, and with a Congressional Medal of Honor, was born for this sort of thing. We arrived on the scene in no time flat. My leader jumped out of the scout car and shouted an order at me, "Stick behind me." We burst into the store. The man behind the counter was surprisingly calm. No doubt he had experienced a robbery or two before. He said, "The guy headed for Division Avenue." That's all I heard. Lieutenant World went out and headed for Division Avenue on foot. I followed orders. I stuck behind him. A light snow had fallen that night. He followed a set of footprints far enough apart to indicate that they had been made by someone who was running. They led into an alley. What in the world was I doing in that alley at 4:30 in the morning and in that part of town? I should have had my head examined. The footsteps led into a yard, around a house, and up its front porch steps. The lieutenant, with the instinct of a hound, bounded up the steps of the large 2-story dwelling. There were no lights on inside. I saw no reason for disturbing the peace of those who were slumbering there. But my leader was of a different persuasion. "Open up!" he yelled, as he banged on the door and then, imagine, kicked it open. His pistol at the ready was in front of him and I was behind him. Didn't he need a search warrant or something? We were inside. He bellowed for lights. To my amazement, lights went on, and there before us stood about 20 people, fully clothed. "Where is he?" shouted the lieutenant. At the same time, still following his instinct, he flew up the stairs as he turned to me and shouted, "Detective, you're in charge." Who, me? There I stood, minus my protector, in a room full of strangers. Their looks were sullen. There was, for me, an unbearable silence. I felt I had to say something. So I said, "I hear we've got a little more snow coming our way today." What a dumb thing to say. What a stupid remark to make to a room full of sullen strangers at 4:30 in the morning. But what were they all doing there anyway, and why wasn't there any furniture? Mercifully, I was in charge for less than a minute. Backup officers came flying through the door. At the same time, my lieutenant friend came downstairs. He had found the culprit hiding in a closet. He led him into the room, handcuffed. The backup officers took over, and we left. Before 7 a.m., we were in the police station. I stayed with the lieutenant while he made his full report. I watched the thief being booked. Someone from the press was hanging around. He took notes. I said, "Good night," or rather, "Good morning," to the lieutenant and some others, went home and tumbled into bed. I woke up at about 3 that afternoon. The paper came. Headline said, "Local clergyman assists in arrest." Actually, all I had done was hide behind the lieutenant as best as I could. Oh yes, and I had remarked about the weather to a room full of strange characters. A mile or so away, my seminary student also woke up, opened his paper, read the headline, and slammed the paper on the floor in disgust. He had missed all the action. The following Sunday, I was something of a hero in church. Youngsters sized me up with new eyes. I sat in the pulpit chair. I looked up at the ceiling and I thought of a lieutenant who had brought more light into our sanctuary and who had made me more conscious of those brave people who patrol our streets at night so that we can sleep in peace. I had invited and followed up on a visitor to our church and got more than I bargained for. The lieutenant never did come back. He had his own church. But we stayed in touch. And even after. I've made it a point to pray for our police and firefighters, our mayors and commissioners, our judges, our social workers, and all those people who are there in God's providence, and without whom our cities would be uninhabitable. Thank you for your attention.